Hello, thank you for joining us here for Atheists Talk. I am here with James Zimmerman. James is, or was, the Minnesota Atheists newsletter editor for several years. He's a frequent host of this program that you're watching here right now, Atheists Talk. And he had recently received, last month at our conference, a Atheist Journalism Award from the Minnesota Atheists. His writings have been published in the book Atheist Voices of Minnesota, available on Amazon.com, The Humanist Magazine, American Atheist Magazine, the St. Paul Almanac, Breathing In, and he's also a local contributor to a book review for a local paper. James is a former Jehovah's Witness, and he left the religion about 7 years ago. He was deeply involved with the door-knocking campaign of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and he held some very important leadership positions in two local congregations here in the Twin Cities. He details his incredible journey from a devoted Jehovah's Witness pioneer to an atheist in his brand new full-length book, Deliverance at Hand, The Redemption of a Devout Jehovah's Witness, and it's published by the Free Thought House. Thank you for joining us here tonight, James.
No problem, Eric. Thanks for having me.
So let me begin with a very basic question. Why did you write this book?
Well, at first I was just writing something for myself. Once I left the religion, I realized that I just needed to get it all out. There were a lot of things that I had tried to sweep under the rug or just say, well, that's just how people are, and then just try to let it go so that I could stay active and faithful in the religion. But once I left the religion, I thought, yeah, none of that stuff made sense anymore, or that stuff really irritated me, and I want to write about it, in just my own blog or my own diary, so to speak. But then I started sculpting it and changing it around until it became more readable to the public, I hope. And then also speaking to the public, I think that even though witnesses are really a public religion in that they show up at your doors, they are also really private. I mean, they even think of themselves as no part of the world. That's a scripture that they quote a lot to show that they remain separate. I mean, they don't come to your holiday parties. They don't get to be good friends with their non-witness neighbors and coworkers and schoolmates. So there's always that distance. So I think that people have questions about them. And so I think my book, apart just from telling my own story, also shows what it's like to be a witness.
Yeah, and I read this book before interviewing you, as a
thanks.
good interviewer would do.
Yeah.
And yeah, the Jehovah's Witnesses struck me as a religion and a group of people who were very much into, and probably were more well-read, they were more experts about the Christian religion than most other kind of sects and most other religious people in the Christian faith are. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I got from a lot of the reading from your book.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, from an overall, obviously there were some witnesses who didn't know, how to find Genesis in the Bible, but there were a lot, in general, they were, I think, more well-versed than most people in other Christian religions are about their faith and about the Bible. And I think that's because they have so many meetings when they meet as a congregation, and they're very low on ceremony and tradition. It's more on actual education. I mean, it's always Watchtower directed education or Bible-specific education, but when they meet, it's not like they're having Mass and bowing down and saying all these prayers. They're reading from the Bible and they're comparing it to world events and stuff. So they really get to know their Bible and compare their faith, especially to other Christian religions.
There's a lot of intellectual discussion among members at the meeting halls. Is that what they're called?
They call them kingdom halls.
Kingdom halls,
yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot of intellectual dialogue between a lot of the people in the halls. Yeah,
to an extent, it's like I said, it's always Watchtower directed, so it's not very critical. Like when a new Watchtower magazine would come to the local congregation, it's not like they would pick it apart and really critically analyze it. They accepted it as divine truth, as having come straight from God, from God's messengers here on earth. So you couldn't doubt that. But if in the article about the Watchtower, if it says to look up these 20 scriptures to help bolster your faith in this one regard, they would look them up. Sometimes there would be references to encyclopedias or dictionaries. They'd look that stuff up too to help them find out why we use certain words in the Bible or whatever. So in that way, yeah, it's a lot more intellectual than just, say, a ceremony where you're breaking bread and wine.
Sure.
Yeah.
in your book also, you have annotated a lot in that book, in that memoir. So why did you do that?
Yeah, several people who looked at early copies of the book joked that it was quite copiously annotated for a memoir, as you said. But witnesses are quick to point out any flaws in anything that someone says about their religion that's not totally painting a rosy picture. So in my book, sometimes I'm just outright ripping on it. Other times I'm just saying, here's how it is, and that's not very flowery. I'm not necessarily saying it's positive or negative. It's just not a flattering picture. So I think it's important to say, here's where I get that from. So in the book, even if I'm just having a conversation with my wife, as often happens in the book, and we say something, I threw in a footnote. I actually had like triple the number that was in there, but through editing, a lot of them got pared down. But yeah, it's still, for a memoir, it's ridiculously annotated. They're all in the back, though, so if that's not your cup of tea, you don't ever have to turn to the end notes.
But it's good that it's there in case anybody wants to.
I think your typical reader can just ignore those 20 pages or whatever at the end. But yeah, if you really want to know,
sure,
it's there. Or if you really are like, I don't think witnesses believed that or said that in their magazines, you can turn to the back and see the reference. So.
Or if you're like me, you'll read the book and you'll just have some faith that the entries in the back actually lead to something that's real.
I didn't think it took faith to read the book, but yeah, that's a nice twist.
So in your book, you talk a lot about the importance of the witness doctrine of Jerusalem following to Babylonia in 607 BC. What's so special about that?
Well, what's special about just about any teaching through the Watchtower is that, I think I already said this, is that it's truth, so you can't doubt it. You can't say, I disagree. You can't say, I'm a witness, but I do disagree with them on this one teaching. No, that's apostasy, and you either have to apologize, show that you're repentant, or leave the religion. So I was trying to research that just from a historical perspective, like you said, to be more intellectual about my faith, and I thought to bolster my faith and to be more intellectual about it. But I discovered that Jerusalem really didn't fall to Babylon in 607, but that the Watchtower Society just said that so that it fits with and I'm not going to go into all the numbers, but they say that the last days began in 1914. And in order for that to fit, you have to say Jerusalem fell in 607. So when I discovered there's a few things in the book that I just kind of uncover accidentally because I was doing research. It's not like I was trying to find holes in the witness doctrine or that I doubted it and I was going to prove them wrong. I just accidentally stumbled on these things because I happen to be more of a reader and researcher than the typical witness, I think.
You just wanted to crystallize kind of some of the
knowledge. I did, yeah, and then in doing that, I just kept checking encyclopedia after encyclopedia, and of course the Watchtower does address that a little bit, like how come other encyclopedias disagree with us about Jerusalem falling in the year 607? They say, oh, they're wrong, they're not following the Bible. But 607 isn't in the Bible. They have to get it from somewhere, and they reference those very same encyclopedias for other dates. So it's funny that they say all those encyclopedias are wrong about this one thing. So that was pretty difficult to come to grapple with, because it's like, do I really think the Watchtower Society is wrong there? Then I'm kind of an apostate,
Right.
Or maybe I'm lacking faith. Maybe God isn't listening to me. I even shared it with my wife at the time, very tenuously, like you see in the book. And even that's nerve-wracking because she could maybe turn me into the elders or say, you're speaking blasphemy. Let's go talk to the elders so they can straighten you out. So.
Right. So, and I want to talk a little bit about some of your own personal experiences too. But since you brought it up about 1914, and we were talking about 607, that had to kind of frame up and fit their narrative with the end of the world coming up. How do the Jehovah's Witnesses view 1914 now that we are almost 100 years past that date?
Yeah, because they used to say it was happening in that generation, which was easy to say in the 1920s, right? The generation of 1914 will be the last one until God brings Armageddon.
Right.
Well, when I was a child in the 80s, they were still saying, it was even on the cover of their magazine every once in a while, 1914, the generation that will not pass away. And they showed these elderly people on the cover who were still around. You could still argue it was the generation of 1914, but I don't think they've disavowed that teaching, but they just don't mention it anymore. It's not on the cover of their magazines. They don't talk about it. And recently, this is after I left, but they said, well, no, now it's the generation, that generation from 1914 will overlap the generation that sees the end, which which extends out the last days for however long, right? Because people from 1914 are still alive, I suppose, so they could overlap with my 3-year-old daughter, who could now live another 100 years. So it's like, I don't know how long they think it will last now.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it almost feels like, after reading your book and learning about some of the teachings from the Watchtower and how they would sometimes, in your example here, kind of cover up things or just not even mention it anymore, ignore it. Seems very kind of Orwellian.
I think so too, yeah. A lot of things are ignored or overlooked after a while.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier about the elders, and I know in your book there's a lot of controversy that you had personally with a couple of the elders, I believe in more than one of the congregations. There's 2 congregations that you were kind of at a disagreement with the elders, and they had some pretty arbitrary rules about that. You want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, the congregation I grew up in, and then that congregation got so big they split off into another one, and then I went over to that one with my family. But as I talk about in the book, I came from a very devout family. They were all witnesses. They were very well known in the local area. Many of them were elders or ministerial servants, which are essentially deacons. So it was really easy, or not really easy. It was easier for me, I think, to excel in the congregation because I was surrounded by all these family members supporting me. And, we were the Zimmermans, and so that was a good thing.
Yeah.
Oh, he's a Zimmerman, he must be a good witness,
Sure.
So then when I became a young adult, I moved out of the house and I moved to another congregation in the city of St. Paul, and suddenly I didn't have that. These people didn't all know who the witnesses or who the Zimmermans were. They didn't know my family background. And I was dating a girl in their congregation, the one that I ultimately married, but her family didn't really have the same, there was hardly any members of her family were witnesses. They weren't that well known. They weren't excelling in the congregation. So I think it was easier for the elders there to push their own ideas and agendas. And in that congregation, I talk about it in the book, but the elders had a lot of their own rules, which is really weird because I'd always been taught that Jehovah's Witnesses were united around the globe. So yes, this congregation says you should go door to door, but they all say that, right? So then I suddenly come to this congregation and they suddenly have rules that I'm like, well, where's this from? This isn't in the Bible. This isn't even in the Watchtower magazines. I would find things in the Watchtower magazines that seemed to contradict what they were saying. Uh-huh. They would even say, well, this is just our opinion, so it's not really what's in the Watchtower magazine. And then I would go home and research, and I would be like, but the Watchtower says that elders shouldn't be giving their own opinions on these certain matters. So it was really a give and take because I would battle with them, but only to an extent because since they were the elders, I was supposed to be in subjection to them and listen to them. So it really created a cognitive dissonance there.
Yeah. I know that, reading your book, I got really infuriated with a couple of the elders who would not let you do something as simple and what I felt was just a very traditional, innocuous thing to put up the just married sign behind your car.
Yeah.
We did that, my wife and me, we did that. That's a very traditional thing. Why were they so upset about that? Do you even know why they were upset about that? Was there power
I can't
control?
figure it out. That is, in the book, that's really what set me over the edge. Not to leaving the religion, but just saying, that's it, I'm leaving this congregation, which was a bold move, because to leave a congregation because you don't like the elders, that's really considered a bad attitude. That's almost showing that you're not trusting in Jehovah's servants who are directing the congregation. But yeah, it was infuriating. I asked them when they had a meeting with us, and of course, they only tell us after we send out the invitations that we can't have a just married sign. So it's not like we can suddenly say, well, we're going to get married in a different Kingdom Hall or out in the park, because we've already sent out the invitations saying where the wedding's going to be. So I felt like they really had us. And I asked them, why can't we have that? And I think that's in the book. Is their best answers were, well, we don't want to put on a showy display. Witnesses try to not be too pompous or too overtly ornate.
Sure.
And that just didn't really seem well. They even said, people driving by, that Kingdom Hall was on a busier street in St. Paul, and they said people driving by might get the wrong idea that that we're pompous people or that we like to put on a showy display, which really didn't make any sense to me because they seemed okay with limousines and horse-drawn carriages, which had been there for other weddings. And obviously we had photos taken outside. It was a summer wedding, so they're okay with a bunch of men in tuxedos and a woman in a white, billowy wedding dress. That's all a very grand display, if you ask me. I mean, comparatively, a sign hanging from your trunk is pretty low-key. So yeah, I couldn't really understand that. And the way they would get around their own rules that I found over the years is that they would say, we're not saying you can't do this. We're going to leave it up to you. So that's kind of their way out, because I can't say, why are you making these rules? They're saying, we're not really making a rule. We're just putting some ideas out and saying, you do it with this what you want. But it's really hard to go against that, because you're supposed to obediently follow the elders, and you know that they could make life tougher for you by making more of those rules in the future. So yeah, it really put us in a tough situation. The only way I could see out of that congregation was just to leave the congregation, and I didn't even give them advance notice, as you can see, because I didn't want them to make life miserable in the last couple months we were there.
Right. You brought up something, just a couple of words that you had mentioned there before about being pompous and overly ornate. Jehovah's Witnesses kind of frown upon that. And my understanding is that Prince is a Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah.
And he seems to be a little ornate.
Yeah.
You know, one could argue that he's pompous. I'm not making that argument necessarily, but just something interesting that I just thought of just now.
Yeah, I think he maybe gets a special pass along with some of the other famous witnesses, because I think the Watchtower Society is afraid to come down too hard on him, because he's got a big audience should he choose to condemn them for something ridiculous.
Maybe they're taking a page out of the Scientology playbook.
Yeah, and, wouldn't be surprised, yeah.
We want some celebrities to help promote the religion. So do you feel like a lot of the elders in other congregations throughout the state of Minnesota, or even throughout the United States, maybe even globally, are also as equally arbitrary and just kind of weird like that?
Yeah, it's tough to say, because of course my sample set is a total of 4 congregations I was a member of in my 30 years as a witness, but it seems that way. And the more involved you are in the religion, the more they're able to make those rules. So later on in the book, I'm not very active in the religion, even though I still believed it and I still did participate. So that helped me to minimize my anxiety and stress, because the elders weren't bothering me that much because they didn't see me around and I wasn't taking that much part. But yeah, from what I've seen, and again, my small sample set, is that in every congregation there's elders making their own nitpicky rules. Yeah. I think that when I was younger, though, it was fine, because those were my family members making a lot of the rules, because the elders were my uncles and my grandparents, so I think it was easy at first, until I was, as you read in the book, till I was about 20 and moved out. So.
And speaking of your family, there's a lot of dysfunction, familial kind of dysfunction going on. Do you feel like Jehovah's Witnesses, that religion also kind of exasperates other relationships in other families as well? Because I know that there was a lot of tension.
Yeah, it's additional stresses, so I think things that are already there are magnified. That's probably the best way to phrase it. My parents, as you can see in the book, didn't have the best of marriages, and it ended up being dissolved. And I think it would have been anyway, even if they were not religious, even if they belonged to a different religion. But I think that the added pressure of being witnesses really exacerbated their issues.
We talked about the family relationships, but also another recurring theme that came up throughout the book was the Noah's Ark story in the Bible, which, from my Bible school lessons back when I was raised in an evangelical home, was back in Genesis, right? So that became something that after you researched more and more and you wanted to learn more and more about Noah's Ark story, that ended up becoming something that kind of deconstructed your faith.
Yeah, that is a recurring theme in the book, and that was by design, because it bothered me even at a young age. I didn't obviously understand the science behind it at that age, but just knowing that God had murdered almost everyone on the planet, including children and babies, was disturbing when I was a child.
Sure.
And when my sister was a baby, and we just seemed so innocent, So that bothered me. And then when I got older and researched it more, then I was married. So my wife and I actually researched it together. Again, not trying to prove it wrong, but trying to bolster our faith and trying to just find more support. And we found a lot of ways where it just couldn't be true. And I think that stands in contrast to a lot of other Bible doctrines, because maybe atheists don't like to admit this, but there's a lot of things in the Bible that you can't prove are not true, right? So, I mean, maybe Lazarus did come back to life after 3 days. I mean, you really can't prove that didn't happen, right? I understand it seems ridiculous, and I don't believe that it is true, but with the flood, it just didn't happen. I mean, there's evidence against it, and we can look in the rocks, and we can just even reason on where all the water would have been and how fast it would have fallen and the size of the ark and the speciation of animal life. When my wife and I studied all this, we were like, okay, it just didn't happen, which means maybe Lazarus didn't also get resurrected, because that's equally ridiculous. There's just no evidence against it, right?
Right.
Maybe the Red Sea didn't part, because that's also equally ridiculous. There's just no evidence against it. So it kind of is, the domino started toppling, That actually was a bigger issue for me, more disconcerting, and made me more upset than the whole when did Jerusalem fall thing, because there I just thought, well, they're wrong about a date. It was 20 years off. They're just 20 years off, whatever. The end will still come. It's just going to come 20 years later than they think. But the flood, I was like, if the Bible is wrong, that's not just a Watchtower teaching. That's in the Bible. So if the Bible is wrong, then we're not even talking about the witnesses being wrong. We're talking about Christianity and Judaism not even making sense. So.
Sure, right, yeah. Much more significant.
Yes.
Yeah. You had talked about a lot of shunning. You were remorseful in your book, I know, about shunning some of your own friends, who you were very close with. You had developed very good, close bonds with them. And I think that was, as a reader, that was a very difficult thing to read, about how you were struggling to actually have to shun these people who you cared about, who you bonded with. And then after you left the faith, you were able to kind of reconcile those relationships. I know that after you left the faith, you were also shunned. Have there been people since you've been shunned who have welcomed you back, or who have, I don't know, what is the word, unshunned you? Or
yeah, no devout witness would stop shunning you. So the only way someone would stop shunning me is the same way I stopped shunning them, is if they leave the religion. There are a few witnesses who, I'm thinking of some family members who didn't totally write us off. Their conscience evidently allows them to call us every once in a while, or to get together with us every once in a great while. So there's about 3 or 4 relatives like that, including one on my wife's side of the family. So they've kind of still stayed with us, but they never totally shunned us anyway.
Oh, okay.
There was actually another friend of mine, someone in the book, but I won't mention them by name. And I even say in the book, I never heard from them again. But that's not exactly true, because about 2 years later, they did call, and they wanted to see how I was doing. And we got together and met at a restaurant, and they said, I checked out your website and thought it was going to be all raving apostasy against the witnesses, and it's just a typical blog of someone just writing about their life. So I thought, oh, maybe he's not so bad. And he asked me why I wasn't a witness anymore. He wanted to get more in detail, and so I told him. And then when I emailed him again to get back together with him, then he said, yeah, I didn't realize you were that you didn't think it was true. Like, I don't think he had been clear on what my stance was before. I think he just thought I was maybe weak in the faith or something.
Okay.
So he since shunned me again, but he did make one more resurgence in my life. But what can you do?
Huh. Okay, so if there was like a Seinfeldian word for that, that'd be like a double shun?
Yeah,
or
double shun would be good, yeah.
So in your book, you talk about, I think you talk about the last decade as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
The last great decade?
Yeah, the last great decade.
Yeah, that's either chapter 3 or 4. That's a term of my own making, and I don't think the book explicitly says it, but I'm talking about the 1980s, because it seems to me that was the last time you could be a devout witness and still be reasonable, because
Sure.
the 1914 wasn't that long ago.
Right.
And one thing they talk about is the growth of the religion. The religion was growing rather quickly at that point, maybe 7 or 8% a year. And the world events seemed to line up pretty decently with what the Watchtower Society said. Like, they said that there was going to be lots of wars in the end, and then suddenly peace and security. So I had known, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, all these different wars, before my time, right? But all these wars leading up to it. And then in the 1980s, suddenly peace and security. The Cold War is even over, the Berlin Wall's coming down. So it seemed like that you could almost make an excuse as to why, especially me as just in my early teens, thought that the religion was true and that the end was coming. But now, once the 80s were over, it kind of got ridiculous because now 1914, like you said, has been a century ago.
Yeah.
And the witnesses who used to point to their growth as aspect of their divine providence, they can't point to that anymore because they're not really growing that fast. And the Cold War ended, but other things took their places. Terrorism. Now 20 countries have nukes instead of 2, right? And there's been other wars. So other wars even that America has fought in. So.
And that is pretty funny too. When I was reading the book, when I saw the narratives that you had with your friends, your family, talking about, well, why should we have kids? What does it matter? I don't know. We're going to be going back up to heaven here in just a few years. It was very strange that you would actually be talking about the end of the world actually just happening. But that's how you were programmed. And
they always, even to this day, I think most of them just think it's no more than 2 or 3 years away. So as a young child and as a teenager, that really has a profound influence on your life. And it still does to this day because of choices I made thinking the end would come.
Yes.
So, I mean, if we think, right, as we're recording this right now, it's 2013. I mean, if we were to somehow know that the end was coming in 2020, that like all life on the planet was going to be destroyed, that would change what you were doing, right? Maybe you wouldn't care if your kids graduated. Maybe you'd rack up credit card bills because you're never going to pay it. Maybe you'd quit your job in 2019 because you know you're just going to coast for the last year. So it really changed, maybe you're going to put off major medical needs too because you're like, I can live with this bad knee for 1 more year. I'm going to, God's going to save me then anyway. So it really affects every aspect of life.
It would be nothing but chocolate and beer.
Right, so it really did. So like even when I was 6, 7 years old and worried about, you're like, oh, these stories you're telling me about high school sound terrible, and my aunt would say, oh, don't worry, you're never going to make it to high school. And you're like, oh, whew. And then one day you're in high school and you're like, what? I didn't prepare for this.
So what I'm hearing you say, James, is that Jehovah's Witnesses promotes hedonism.
If you follow this line of,
Well, James, I think we're about out of time here, but I just want to make sure that our audience knows that they can get your book, Deliverance at Hand, The Redemption of a Devout Jehovah's Witness, on Amazon.com. You can also visit freethoughthouse.com as well.
Yeah, that's the publisher.
That's the publisher, and you can find the books, Deliverance at Hand, at those 2 websites. And in conclusion, I just want to make sure that our audience knows that if they are interested in us, we are interested in you. We would like you to contact us at the information that you see at our screen. And you can also visit us at facebook.com, twitter.com, and our address, minnesotaatheists.org, O-R-G. If you contact us, we will send you a complimentary issue of the Minnesota Atheist newsletter, which is very nicely newly formatted here by our new editor, Lewis Campbell. So thank you very much, Lewis. And with that, also real quick, thank you, James, for the tie clip, this nice green tie here for tonight.
Beautiful,
so thank you very much.